I thought the worst news I'd ever face was my cancer diagnosis. But the real devastation came when I uncovered the lies that had been living right under my roof. The doctor's voice was composed, steady but distant. Norman, it's stage 2. We caught it early enough to maintain hope, but the road ahead won't be easy. Norman Barger sat motionless across from the oncologist, his mind swirling in disbelief and dread. Cancer. It was a word that had always seemed to belong to others, people on TV or distant relatives he barely remembered. Never him. Not now. At 42, he was at his peak, successful in his career, happily married to a remarkable woman, and the father of 2 incredible kids. Life wasn't supposed to derail like this. The walls of the sterile office seemed to press inward as the doctor outlined the treatment plan: chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. Norman tried to follow, but the words soon dissolved into a blur. One thought drowned out everything else: I can't tell Victoria. It wasn't a question of love or trust. Norman loved his wife with all his heart. Victoria had been his rock through life's smaller setbacks. But something had shifted between them in recent months. She seemed distant, preoccupied. Her phone was always in her hands, and she often came home late from her volunteer work at the youth center. The last thing Norman wanted was to burden their already strained relationship with this news. Right there in the doctor's office, he resolved to carry this weight on his own. That evening, when he walked through the front door, the house felt the same as always, but he saw it differently now. Victoria was on the living room couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely acknowledged him when he came in. Upstairs, Carol, their teenage daughter, had her music blaring. Derek, their youngest, was absorbed in his PlayStation. Just another regular evening in the Barger household. Anything exciting? Norman asked, nodding toward her phone. Just emails from the youth center, Victoria answered swiftly, locking her screen and placing the phone beside her. Norman forced a smile, determined to push aside his fears for now. I was thinking, maybe we could have a family dinner this weekend. Just the 4 of us. How about that Italian place downtown? Victoria hesitated. Something unreadable flashed in her eyes before she spoke. I think I'm busy Saturday, Victoria replied softly. The youth center fundraiser is that night. Norman's heart sank, but he quickly masked his disappointment. Maybe Sunday. Sunday works, she said, giving a faint smile before turning back to her phone. Later that night, Norman found himself in the upstairs bathroom, locking the door behind him. He stood in front of the mirror, silently inspecting his reflection, tracing the lines of his face as if searching for some physical sign of the disease lurking inside him. His mind raced with the weight of everything: the diagnosis, the treatments ahead, and the gnawing suspicion about his wife. You're stronger than this, he whispered under his breath. He wanted to believe it. But no matter how many times he repeated those words, the sinking feeling wouldn't leave. It wasn't just fear of the cancer, it was the unsettling thought that Victoria was slipping away from him. Something had shifted between them, and he could no longer ignore it. He needed to know what had changed. That night, as he lay in bed beside her, the sound of Victoria's steady breathing filled the room. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Norman stared at the ceiling, his thoughts looping endlessly. He replayed the past year in his mind, the late nights, the excuses, the hushed phone conversations. He wanted to trust her, but too many things didn't add up. The next morning, Victoria left early, mentioning she had a meeting with the youth center's board. Norman hesitated as he watched her walk out the door, then made a decision he never thought he would. He grabbed his phone and logged into their shared account. It wasn't something he was proud of, but he couldn't fight the need for answers anymore. Scanning through her call history, one number stood out, appearing repeatedly. He copied it down and, after a moment of hesitation, dialed it, disguising his voice. Hello? A man's voice answered on the other end. Sorry, Norman stammered. I think I dialed the wrong number. May I ask who this is? There was a brief pause before the man replied, This is Jonathan Elmer. I'm a counselor at the youth center. Norman's jaw tightened. He had only met Jonathan once, in passing, but his name had come up often enough in Victoria's stories to stir suspicion. Oh, sorry about that, Norman said, keeping his voice steady before hanging up. That evening, when Victoria returned home, Norman had already made up his mind. He needed to get to the bottom of things, about Jonathan, about the growing space between them. If she wasn't going to tell him the truth, he would find it another way. But there was also another storm brewing inside him. His cancer treatments were scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and he couldn't afford to fall apart. He needed to summon every ounce of strength, not just to fight the disease but to face the unsettling truths that were beginning to surface in his life. Norman knew he had to do more than just survive the cancer. He needed to take back control of his crumbling life and hold his family together. On Monday, he began chemotherapy. The treatment room was lined with recliners occupied by patients, all quietly battling their own private wars. The antiseptic air was thick with the hum of 4 pumps and murmured conversations. Norman tried to concentrate on his work, his laptop open in front of him as he sketched designs for an upcoming project. Yet his mind refused to stay anchored. His thoughts drifted endlessly between his illness and the deepening cracks in his marriage. The fatigue hit harder and faster than he had expected. By the time he got home that afternoon, his vision blurred at the edges, and his body ached as though he had run a marathon. Victoria was nowhere to be found, off at another meeting, no doubt. In the days that followed, Norman's symptoms weren't unbearable, but the relentless exhaustion weighed on him like a suffocating fog. At home, he claimed he was fighting off a flu bug to explain away his sluggishness. Victoria, too distracted to notice much, accepted the excuse without question. It was a bitter paradox, her indifference both hurt and brought him relief. That Friday evening, during dinner, Victoria set down her fork and made an announcement. I'm going out of town for a seminar with Jonathan Elmer. It's for the youth center. We're presenting a new program that we want to implement. Norman kept his face neutral, though a knot formed in his stomach. Sounds important, he said calmly. When will you be back? Sunday night, she replied, her eyes darting to the side as if she couldn't meet his gaze. His gut tightened, but he maintained his composure. You and Jonathan make a great team, he said, his voice steady. The youth center is lucky to have you both. For a moment, her smile wavered, just for a heartbeat. Yeah, we work well together, she replied softly. That brief hesitation said more than words ever could. It confirmed what Norman had feared but refused to confront for far too long. Later that night, when Victoria had fallen asleep, Norman quietly slipped out of bed and made a call. He contacted Ruby Lambert, a private investigator his friend Brian had recommended. Before we begin, Ruby said after hearing his story, you need to be absolutely certain this is the path you want to take. Once we move forward, there's no turning back. Norman exhaled slowly, his mind clear for the first time in weeks. I'm sure, he answered quietly. He had fought hard to avoid this moment, but now he knew there was no other way. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Ruby's voice echoed in his mind, are you ready for what I might find? Once I dig into her personal life, there's no turning back. Norman closed his eyes and thought about everything, the late nights, the excuses, the moments that never made sense. He had spent too long trapped in uncertainty. I need the truth, he finally said, his voice quiet but resolute. All right, Ruby responded, her tone firm. I'll get started right away. The next morning, Victoria left early, a suitcase neatly tucked in the trunk of her car. Norman watched from the window, his stomach churning as the car disappeared down the street. Hours later, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Ruby. Attached was a photo of Victoria and Jonathan standing outside a hotel lobby. They weren't doing anything blatantly inappropriate, just standing close and talking. But it was the closeness, the ease between them, that sent a cold shiver down Norman's spine. He texted back a simple, "Keep going." The following afternoon, Norman was lying on the couch, exhaustion from the chemo dragging him down, when the doorbell rang. The kids were out, and he wasn't expecting anyone. Slowly, he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he was stunned to find Jonathan Elmer standing there, holding a casserole dish. "Norman," Jonathan greeted warmly, flashing a charming smile. "Victoria mentioned you weren't feeling well, so I thought I'd bring this by. Chicken and rice, my mom's recipe." Norman's pulse quickened, but he kept his face composed. "Thanks," he said, taking the dish from Jonathan's hands. After a moment, he added, "Want to come in for a minute?" Jonathan hesitated briefly before nodding. "Sure, if you're up for it." They moved to the living room and sat down. Jonathan launched into casual conversation about the youth center and the projects Victoria had been working on. Norman listened, watching closely, noting every gesture and inflection. He stayed quiet for a while, then spoke, his tone calm and measured. "You and Victoria seem close." Jonathan chuckled softly. "Yeah, she's incredible. The youth center wouldn't be what it is without her." Norman nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's good to hear. She's always had a gift for making people feel connected." For a fleeting moment, something flickered across Jonathan's face, an emotion Norman couldn't quite place. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Norman noticed. He tucked the detail away, adding it to the growing puzzle in his mind. Later that evening, as the house grew quiet, Norman's phone buzzed again. It was Ruby. He braced himself as he reached for the device, knowing each message brought him closer to the truth he was no longer sure he wanted to face. Ruby's messages kept coming through one after another. Victoria and Jonathan checked into the hotel together. They requested adjoining rooms, same reservation. Not much activity today. Just saw them leave for dinner. Norman stared at the screen, his hands trembling. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, deep breath. Losing his temper wouldn't accomplish anything. If he wanted to get through this, he needed to stay calm and methodical. Anger could wait, he had to outthink them. Victoria returned late Sunday night, her hair slightly out of place and her expression weary. Norman met her at the door with a soft, disarming smile. "How was the seminar?" he asked casually. "Exhausting," she replied, brushing past him, dragging her suitcase behind her. "I'm going straight to bed." Norman nodded, watching her as she ascended the stairs. He held the gentle smile on his face until she disappeared from view. Once she was out of sight, his expression hardened. "She's had her chance to tell me the truth, and she didn't take it." As he lay awake that night beside her, he listened to the rhythmic sound of her breathing. It was once a source of comfort for him, something that had anchored him during difficult times. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of her deceit. He wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without a plan. But one thing was crystal clear, the lies would unravel. Bit by bit, he would dismantle everything they thought they had hidden. Victoria and Jonathan had underestimated him. By Monday morning, Norman sat at his desk, sipping black coffee that barely lifted the fog of exhaustion clouding his mind. His laptop screen displayed a flood of emails requiring attention, but he couldn't focus. Instead, he opened the digital folder Ruby had sent. He scrolled through the photos and notes, each one a piece of a sinister puzzle. This wasn't just personal, it was orchestrated. Calculated. Norman's thoughts sharpened. If Jonathan was targeting Victoria, it wasn't merely for companionship. There was something more at play. Norman understood now that Jonathan's motives likely extended beyond the affair. Whatever scheme he was a part of, Norman would expose it. That evening, Norman stayed late at the office, pretending to catch up on work. In truth, he was making his first move. His years in his career had given him access to resources, and he intended to use every one of them. Favors were being pulled from private investigators and contacts in discreet security services. By the time he arrived home, he noticed a shift in Victoria's behavior. There was a quiet tension around her now, subtle but telling. Her smile seemed forced, never quite reaching her eyes. She avoided eye contact whenever Jonathan's name was mentioned. One night, as they lay in bed, Norman turned toward her, keeping his tone gentle and casual. "You've been working with Jonathan a lot lately," he said softly. "How's that been going?" He saw the briefest flicker of tension in her expression before she answered. That moment, though fleeting, was all the confirmation he needed. The game was in motion, and Norman intended to win. "I feel like things have been a little off between us lately," Norman said gently, turning toward Victoria. "Maybe we should spend more time together, reconnect a bit." Victoria's face softened, but to Norman, it was a mask, practiced sincerity. "That's a great idea," she replied, her voice warm but not entirely convincing. "I've been feeling the same way." Norman nodded as though reassured, but inwardly, his disbelief tightened. He knew better. She's still hiding something, he thought. That afternoon, Norman met with Ruby in her office. She scanned through the documents and photos on her tablet, a smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Your friend Jonathan's been busy," she said with a chuckle. "These look like payment schedules and unreported income. He's either hiding money, laundering it, or both. Can you connect him to anything concrete?" Norman asked, his voice steady and firm. "I'll need more time," Ruby replied, scrolling through the files. "But from what I've seen so far, he's definitely dirty. Give me a week, and I'll have something more solid." Later that evening, over dinner, Norman casually steered the conversation back to the youth center. "So, how's everything going with the center?" he asked, watching Victoria carefully. Her fork paused in midair for just a second before she resumed eating. "Oh, things are good," she replied. "Busy but rewarding." Norman leaned back, keeping his tone light. "Jonathan mentioned some big plans for expansion. Said he might need help managing the finances if it goes through. You think you'd take on more responsibility?" Victoria shifted slightly in her seat, her discomfort subtle but not lost on Norman. "I don't know," she said with a forced smile, quickly changing the subject. Norman filed away every reaction like evidence, his strategy unfolding perfectly. He wasn't just passively gathering information anymore, he was actively setting traps. Within days, whispers of suspicion began to circulate in nonprofit circles. Ruby had uncovered just enough to spark rumors about Jonathan's financial dealings. Norman knew someone well-placed who had a passion for exposing corruption in nonprofit organizations. Through this contact, concerns about the youth center's integrity started to spread. Emails questioning the legitimacy of Jonathan's operations rippled through the community, and Jonathan's meticulously crafted reputation, built on charm and altruism, began to fracture. Norman pressed on, quietly satisfied as he observed the cracks widening. His plan was working. Meanwhile, he endured the effects of chemotherapy with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for his health had become secondary to his determination to dismantle the web of deceit surrounding him. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was making sure Victoria and Jonathan would fully understand the consequences of their betrayal. With every new rumor, every new crack in Jonathan's carefully constructed image, Norman could see his endgame approaching. He leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to savor the progress. The tide was beginning to turn. Norman watched as everything began to unravel. Ruby's strategic leaks triggered just enough suspicion to prompt an official investigation. A few days later, Jonathan received a letter from the IRS notifying him of an audit. Norman pictured the panic on Jonathan's face as he read the letter, and he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. But this was far from over, it was only the beginning. On a chilly Thursday afternoon, Ruby called him. Her voice carried a hint of amusement. "You're going to like this," she said. Jonathan's not just a fraud, he's a serial offender. He's been laundering money through non-profits for years. Norman's jaw tightened. The very thought that Jonathan might have used funds from their shared community resources, possibly even siphoning from accounts Norman had spent years building, made his blood boil. But he forced himself to stay composed. Losing control wouldn't help him now. "What's our next move?" he asked, his tone even. Ruby hesitated for a moment. "Do you want to go public now or keep this as leverage?" "Not yet," Norman replied after a pause. "I want her to feel the walls closing in. She needs to come to me first. I want her to squirm." That weekend, Norman suggested a family trip to the botanical gardens. Carol and Derek weren't thrilled at first but agreed after some convincing. Victoria, however, appeared distracted the entire time, frequently checking her phone. At one point, as they stood near the orchid exhibit, Norman casually said, "The youth center must be demanding a lot of your time lately. You've really been putting in the effort." Victoria smiled weakly. "Yeah. It's rewarding, you know." "I'm sure it is," Norman replied softly, his calm voice masking an undertone of menace. "You're making a real difference." The words hit with precision. He saw her discomfort, her smile faltered, and she shifted uneasily. It was a small but satisfying victory. By Monday morning, Norman was ready to escalate. He anonymously sent the evidence Ruby had collected to a local news outlet. The package included financial records exposing fraud and discrepancies at the youth center, along with screenshots implicating Victoria's involvement. He didn't care about sparing anyone at this point. He wanted Jonathan publicly exposed and humiliated, and he knew the fallout would reach Victoria too. That evening, as the story broke, Norman watched Victoria pace the kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was pale, her movements frantic. He leaned casually against the doorway, pretending to sip his tea. "Rough day?" he asked lightly. Victoria froze for a moment, then turned to him with a forced smile. "Just, a lot going on at the youth center." "I saw the news," Norman said, feigning surprise. "Crazy, right? Jonathan, who would have thought?" Her face drained of color. "Yeah. It's shocking," she mumbled, struggling to maintain composure. "You didn't see this coming?" he asked, his voice almost playful but laced with subtle menace. "No, not at all," she stammered, avoiding his gaze. Norman nodded thoughtfully, savoring her discomfort. He could see the cracks forming, the shadows of the confident, untouchable woman she once was. For a brief moment, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the memory of her betrayal hardened his resolve. This was far from over. Norman felt the faintest twinge of pity as he watched Victoria crumble before him, but it vanished just as quickly. This was the storm she had created, and now she was drowning in it. "What's that?" Norman asked coolly, setting down the cutting board he'd been using to prepare dinner. Victoria's voice trembled as she held out the paper in her shaking hand. "It's a subpoena," she whispered. "They want me to testify about Jonathan." Norman didn't take the paper right away. Instead, he crossed his arms and studied her, his face unreadable. He watched the fear in her eyes grow as tears began to fall. "I didn't know what he was doing," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "He told me it was all for the youth center, for the kids. I thought I was helping." A bitter laugh escaped Norman's lips. "Helping?" he echoed, his voice low and cold. "You weren't helping, you were funding his schemes. You were his accomplice, whether you knew it or not. And now you're tied to everything he's done." Victoria broke down completely, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. For a moment, Norman considered the possibility that she had been truly naive, that she had trusted Jonathan without realizing the extent of his crimes. But the betrayal, the lies, and the months of deception weighed too heavily for him to let her off the hook. Her lips trembled as she finally raised her head, tears streaking her face. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," she stammered weakly. Norman straightened, his gaze hard. "It's too late to fix it, Victoria. You can't undo what's already been done. The only thing you can do now is damage control, and even that won't save your reputation." Victoria bowed her head in defeat, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of her choices had finally crushed her. In the days that followed, the scandal hit its peak. Jonathan's arrest dominated the headlines on every local news outlet. Reporters eagerly dissected his fraudulent schemes, and Victoria's name was mentioned frequently in connection to the investigation. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. The fallout affected the entire family, leaving an air of tension and uncertainty in the house. Even Carol and Derek began noticing the change. One evening, as Norman helped Carol with her homework, she looked up at him with a concerned expression. "Why is Mom always so upset?" she asked softly. Norman hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She's going through a tough time," he said gently. "But she loves you and Derek very much." Carol frowned, her brows knitting together. "Is it because of the news?" she asked. "I saw her name on TV." Norman's heart sank. He hadn't expected his children to be exposed to the scandal so directly. "What did you see?" he asked, keeping his tone as calm as he could. "They were talking about that guy from the youth center," Carol said hesitantly. "They said Mom gave him money, and something about a deal." Norman sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He knew the truth couldn't be kept hidden much longer. His children deserved honesty, but he wasn't sure how much of it they could handle. Still, he had to protect them, just as he had vowed to protect himself from the lies that had torn their family apart. "If I testify against Jonathan, they might not press charges against me," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking as fresh tears streamed down her face. "Norman, I don't know what to do." Norman stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold and unyielding. "You tell them everything," he said, his voice low but firm. "No matter how much it hurts. Because if you don't, Jonathan will throw you under the bus, and you'll go down with him." She nodded shakily, her entire body trembling. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, collapsing onto the couch as tears overtook her once again. Norman stood silently, his face hardened with resolve. The destruction wrought by their choices had left wreckage in its wake, but to him, this was the only way forward. Sometimes, things had to fall apart completely before they could be rebuilt. Victoria's sobs echoed through the room, but he felt no sympathy, only a cold sense of finality. He would shield their children from the mess, but Victoria would have to face the consequences on her own. The scandal continued to escalate, reaching the school where Carol and Derek attended. Questions became harder to avoid, and Norman found himself having to explain more than he ever wanted to. Eventually, Ruby called with an update. "The deal is public now," she informed him. Jonathan admitted to funneling money through the youth center and manipulating his relationships to cover it up. "Your wife's name was mentioned, but the evidence against her is thin. If she handles things correctly, she might avoid charges." Norman sighed, his voice devoid of emotion. "That's not my concern anymore." "What about the kids?" Ruby asked after a pause. "They'll be fine," Norman replied firmly. "I'll make sure of it." Ruby hesitated. "And you? Are you fine?" Norman stared at the floor, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He didn't answer her question. Weeks later, in court, Victoria faced her reckoning. After providing her testimony against Jonathan, she approached Norman outside the courtroom, her face tear-streaked and full of desperate hope. "We can get through this," she whispered softly. Norman shook his head slowly. "There is no us," he said after a long pause. "Not anymore." Her face crumpled, but he didn't wait to see her reaction. He turned and walked away without looking back. In the months that followed, Norman completed his cancer treatments. His body was weak, but he was slowly recovering. He threw himself into his work and focused on being a father, rebuilding his life one piece at a time. Victoria moved out, renting a small apartment across town. She visited the kids regularly, but the distance between her and Norman remained vast and unbridgeable. One evening, Norman sat quietly in his chair, gazing thoughtfully at the life he was reconstructing. The man who had once been broken by betrayal now stood stronger than before, determined to protect the future he was carving out for himself and his children. "I want what's best for Carol and Derek," Norman said quietly. "They need stability." Laura, his attorney, nodded thoughtfully. "Do you believe Victoria can provide that?" Norman hesitated before answering. "I think she loves them," he admitted. "But she's lost right now. I don't think she can give them what they need." "Then we'll push for primary custody," Laura said firmly. "But be prepared, she might contest it." Norman's jaw tightened. "I'll fight if I have to." Surprisingly, Carol and Derek adjusted to the new reality faster than Norman had anticipated. They adapted to the routine of splitting time between their parents, each finding their own way through the storm of changes. On a Saturday afternoon, Norman stood on the sidelines of Derek's soccer game, watching his son race across the field. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of pride and relief. Despite everything, his children were resilient. They were thriving. When the custody hearing finally arrived, Norman walked into the courtroom prepared. Laura sat beside him as he watched Victoria take the stand. She spoke candidly about her mistakes, owning up to her poor judgment and promising to do better for their children. It was a difficult moment to witness, but Norman knew her words were genuine. However, it didn't change the fact that the kids needed consistency, something he was determined to provide. His own testimony was direct and measured. He emphasized his commitment to giving Carol and Derek a stable, supportive environment. He expressed his concerns about Victoria's recent struggles without sounding vindictive, focusing on what was best for their children. In the end, the judge granted Norman primary custody. Victoria would still have regular visitation, but for now, the children's home base would be with him. As the legal battles concluded, Norman found himself slowly reclaiming a sense of normalcy. He sought support from a cancer survivors group, finding comfort in the shared stories of resilience and recovery. At work, he poured his energy into a new project, designing a community center that would offer after-school programs for kids. The project became a symbol of renewal for him, a way to give back and create a space where other families could find strength and hope. For the first time in a long while, Norman felt a deep sense of peace. His body was healing, his children were flourishing, and his life, though forever changed, was moving forward. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time.